involved, and I'll pass over to Camilla now.
Okay, thank you very much. So once again, welcome to All Arranged 2024 and the opening session on feminism and the rise of the far right. I'm delighted to be chairing this opening session, especially delighted given the caliber of our guest speakers. So we have Kavita Krishnan and Sian Norris. Kavita is a long-standing socialist feminist based in India and the author of Fearless Freedom. Her activism and intellectual importance, I think, really got noticed on the international scene immediately following the Delhi gang rape case in 2012 and the subsequent mass protests that followed that. Sian is a freelance investigative journalist, and she is the author of Bodies Under Siege, a groundbreaking and definitive study of far-right misogyny and how to fight it, as one reviewer put it. So we have two courageous and inspiring speakers. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Kavita to speak first, followed by Sian. There will be time for questions, comments from the audience prior to them summing up just before lunch. So Kavita, very warm welcome. Over to you for 10 to 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you all for, and I wish I could be there in person. Thank you, Camila, for inviting me. And I'm so eager to listen to what Sian has to say. And let me get to it without any other loss of time. I think we are all very aware with the recent victory of Trump in the elections. We know how central certain themes were to his campaign. For instance, immigration, and for instance, a seemingly disproportionate emphasis on the bogey of trans identity and the threats it represents. And that is probably not an outlier. We've seen it in, I think, similar themes all across Western countries in far-right campaigns. But I also think, speaking from someone in India, I would like to, bring a perspective. A lot of people don't connect this with the way in which gender and moral panics around gender are central to far-right and authoritarian campaigns, not just in the West, but in India and in the global South as well. So I just want to, and I would in fact say that in order to understand what's happening in the West as well, we have to be aware of how there's a symbiosis, even a borrowing of certain kinds of concepts which are central to Hindu supremacist authoritarianism, how they are being internationally amplified by a global anti-democratic agenda. So I just want to quickly focus on that. So we know how, Vladimir Putin, his speeches during his invasion of Ukraine for the last 2 years, they spend a disproportionate amount of time attacking LGBT rights, same-sex families and transgender, identity, and the attack on the family institution, all of which he codes as an example of not only of Western imperialism, but specifically what he calls the dictatorship of Western liberal elites. And he says that there is a resistance to this, not only from civilizations across the world, in which he names Hindus and Muslims and so on, and the nations they supposedly represent these identities. But he also says that the majority inside Western countries is rising up against this liberal elite minority that is imposing its degenerate values and saying they are universal for the whole world. So I think it's worth paying attention to this because his audience is not just inside Russia. These speeches are very much aimed at and very much amplified, for instance, in India and certainly in other parts of the global South. And there's this smooth shift between an attack on Western imperialism and then to these examples. In India, the way in which these themes play out. In the West, I think that even immigration plays to the same kinds of fears to which, say, LGBT rights or abortion plays, which is the notion of nature, which is the idea of the natural body, which is the idea, ideas about, demography and demographic overthrow, and population danger, and what's going to happen to the civilization if everybody becomes trans, if everybody becomes gay, what's going to happen, and the pollution, moral pollution as well as a demographic pollution, and inherent and sexual danger. So rape, who is going to be the threat of rape. And the idea of mixing not only of races or ethnicities, but mixing of, the ideas of sex and gender. I think those are things in common. If you think about immigration, it's very, very similar themes playing out. The immigrant as the potential rapist, the one whose culture doesn't fit. It's Muslims marrying non-Muslims. This is all going to be very dangerous. They will overtake us in terms of numbers and so on. In India, I think that it's a very classic example of this. One of the central things which is absolutely crucial to the Modi campaign is love jihad. So this refers to the fear of Muslims, this so-called conspiracy under which Muslim men, seduce Hindu women, trap them in the name of love, and marry them in order to produce more Muslims. This is going to, increase the Muslim population. And this is also part of a terrorist conspiracy that's international, and so on and so forth. And this plays to an already existing, and very widespread, almost universal social anxiety in India, which is inspired by caste, but which is not, limited to the Hindu community alone, which is that your daughter needs to be protected from herself, from marrying outside the caste. And so there's an, anxiety, where you even talk about sexual violence. So intercaste marriage or interfaith marriage, a girl who is, a woman who is marrying someone or having a relationship against the wishes of her parents. These are often recorded, 40% of rape, so-called rape statistics in India are actually instances of consensual elopements, which the woman's parents have then gone to the police and registered as rapes. So this tells you something of what's happening. And of course, the idea of the Bangladeshi immigrant, all Muslims are Bangladeshis and they are running love jihad, etc. That's happening. In the recent elections, which have just concluded today, the results are out today in one of the Indian states. The BJP Modi lost, but Modi's entire campaign there was addressed to the oppressed, indigenous community, the Adivasi community, telling them that Muslims are going to take away your women, your daughters, lock up your daughters, be careful, that kind of thing. Love jihad was huge there. And this whole thing is premised on, there's a code to which they're speaking. This social anxiety in India, one of the most sort of pure expressions of this is the Manusmriti, and which is a sort of Hindu's, scriptural code, moral code, written centuries ago, but which the Hindu right wing has always used as a counter to India's constitution to say, this is Hindu law and so on. Essentially, it is about maintaining caste hierarchies, a whole lot of rules, and immense anxiety about how you need to control women, keep women in the family under control in order to prevent the chaos and anarchy. And there are punishments for marriage when women marry, for men who marry above them, so above their caste. So this, of course, when Modi speaks of it, is not a literal thing. They're not saying, okay, let's order everything according to caste. But I think that in India, as well as internationally, it's very interesting how this particular trope has gone global. And So the idea of the moral world turned upside down. If Manu's laws are violated, if women are allowed to roam free, what's going to happen? If gender and sex are all mixed up, what's going to happen? So the idea is that Kali Yuga is upon us. So this term Kali Yuga is a term which signifies sexual and social degradation and the moral world turned upside down, where the oppressed castes are on top and women are doing whatever, all of that. But in the modern sense, I think the way it has become extremely popular across alt-right subcultures in the West. And I will give specific examples of how very prominent far-right ideologues and propagandists are also using this. And why is that the case? I believe because Kali Yuga has become more than a very specific reference to a Hindu caste hierarchy or even a caste hierarchy. It's a general sense where it's become a useful thing where I think the main issue, ideological issue in the world now is that the far right is playing to the idea that majoritarianism has lost its moral authority. It still has social power. The caste or the gender or caste or racial hierarchies, all of these have social power. They still do. But they don't have moral power. So bigotry has become, not cool. Liberal democracy has become the kind of standard by which countries are judged. So the idea is that all these tyrants are using a similar language to send out the message that this is wrong. We are the majority. And the individual's liberty and the liberty of minorities, these are basically completely wrong. These are immoral. And we need to restore the moral order by restoring moral authority to, whatever bigotry is supposed to represent the majority. So I'm just going to come down to and Kali Yuga is a very specific code for this. I'll give you the examples. So you have Steve Bannon talking about Kali Yuga on several occasions. You have Joe Rogan, who is the popular sort of radio propagandist, where Trump attends his shows a lot. So Joe Rogan has said in 2021 on a couple of occasions that we are in the Kali Yuga, and Kali Yuga is basically this immoral order where the liberal elites have turned everything upside down. And it's a time to correct that and, to end the Kali Yuga. After that comes, good times again. And Dugin, who is Alexander Dugin, who is the Russian, I would say he's the most influential, or one should read him to understand what is the core ideology of this global anti-democratic coalition, which may be geopolitically in contradiction, but ideologically it's very solid. So Dugin in India in 2012 and elsewhere as well, he said that Kali Yuga, we are in Kali Yuga today, we need to overturn that. Kali Yuga is the age of human rights, anti-hierarchy, and political correctness. Elsewhere, he said it's the age of gender ideology and so on. And liberal ideology. His daughter, his late daughter, who was killed, she has said, she's written this whole thing on Kali Yuga where she said that Kali Yuga is the era of democracy and how democracy represents moral degeneration, sexual degeneration, miscegenation, and all of that. So I think that I would just like to say that in the short time that I have here, I'm willing to talk about it. I've been trying to write about it, that we need to pay attention to the way in which the attack on democracy and, is coded. Gender is absolutely central to the way in which it's coded. And it's how it is able to persuade communities which counterintuitively to support a far-right campaign. Why Trump is able to build a diverse coalition, because gender is that one place which is especially vulnerable to all kinds of moral panics, and moral panics over sexual violence, moral panics over the nature of sex and gender, and over the mixing of races or castes or so on, and communities. I think people are especially ideologically vulnerable to these, even communities which are otherwise oppressed. And so our campaign has to factor this in. The campaign, a feminist campaign is, I know we know this, but then in a very specific way, it has to be central to the campaign to defend democratic principles. And I am absolutely someone who I know, if I keep having to tell people that if socialism is being defined by anyone as a sort of rejection of liberal democracy and, liberal democracy is failing, Trump has won. It just shows that these institutions are all failed and now we need to be all radical and, fight for a socialist alternative. I disagree. I think that, socialism is a fight for a more consistent and an expansion of democracy. Whatever we call liberal democratic values are values that people have fought for. Even the left has fought for, and their recognition in constitutions or in universal, human rights documents are not something which are part of conspiracies of certain regimes. In fact, even people within those regimes within the US, for example, have fought for those universal principles and then used those universal principles against the US. WBE, Du Bois, and the NAACP are a good example of their engagement with the United Nations post Second World War. So I just want to say that the defense of democratic principles, how do we do that? How do we frame feminism and feminist concerns also in these terms? And how do we frame democratic rights campaigns in terms of why people need democracy and putting feminism front and center there? That's what I'd like to say today. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to hand over to Sian before throwing it out to the audience. So Sian, you have 10, 15 minutes.
Just wanted to say there's lots of seats at the front if people are searching for seats. I know some people are standing at the back. So yeah, thank you so much. What an amazing talk from Kavita. And I don't know, I was just nodding along because there were so many things that were recognizable and also enraging and also giving potential room for hope and change. It's really great to be here. I love the name of this event, All a Rage. I am full of rage, but I am also full of optimism. So hopefully we can balance those two things today. So yeah, I wanted to start this talk just by giving a little bit of background into how I got into investigating the far-right links with anti-abortion movements. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how this far-right activism manifests, how it has gone mainstream, how it's been funded, and then a little look to the future now that we have a second Trump presidency and what this means for abortion rights. And I'm going to do it all in 15 minutes. That's a whole book. So yeah, a few years ago, I was looking around for something to write about as a journalist, and I was always really interested in abortion activism. I was very active in the feminist movement, and I started to have a look at what anti-abortion movements in the UK look like. And what I was expecting was kind of very religious, potentially Catholic or evangelical movements. And instead, what I found was this organization called the UK Life League, which had been set up by a man named Jim Dowson. Now, Dowson, as I'm sure you know, is more famous for his, Islamophobic far-right activism, first with the organization Britain First, and now with the Knights Templar International, absolutely my favorite far-right organization that allows men to become knights if they pay £1,500. Get a shield. And he set up this organization called the UK Life League, which claims that it was the pioneer of using very graphic anti-abortion imagery outside clinics and outside hospitals. And so I was like, okay, why is Jim Dowson, a man famous for organizing anti-migrant protests and Islamophobic protests and targeting asylum-seeking people's accommodation, particularly in hotels, what is he doing getting so involved with anti-abortion activism? And I started looking through their literature, and over again, I was coming across this very, very, racist, white supremacist, conspiracy theory language that had its roots in fascism and in far-right activity, namely the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. And what I learned was that the modern anti-abortion movement, as well as having obviously links to religious groups and, the Catholic Church and evangelical churches, was actually very, very rooted in this far-right belief that we need to restore the fascistic natural order, which means women are subordinate to men, Black and minority ethnic people are subordinate to white people, and LGBTQ people just don't get to exist. And this was really obvious to me in this literature because the way that UK Life League was talking about abortion was in this language of replacement. So it would say things like, as a result of abortion, there are aliens in the classroom where our children should be, which is a direct echo of something Mussolini said in 1922. So I started digging more and more, and I was looking at more and more far-right Telegram channels and incel forums to try and get a sense of whether this was a one-off or whether this was actually fundamental to the modern anti-abortion movement. And it was increasingly obvious to me that what we were seeing was a very organized far-right attack on anti-abortion rights using the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. Now, I'm sure most people in this room know what the Great Replacement conspiracy theory is, but I'll just give it a quick rundown just in case. So Great Replacement believes that white people are being replaced in the global north by brown people from the global south, that this replacement is being aided by feminists who repress the white birth rate through abortion and contraception, and of course, it's all being organized by the Jews. This is a classic far-right conspiracy theory that is absolutely baseless. There is no evidence that any of this is happening, but they have this narrative of white genocide, and they blame migration and abortion for fueling this white genocide. And so an example of this is the far-right influencer Mark Collett, who founded the Patriotic Alternative organization, posted a cartoon on his Telegram channel that had a picture of hijabi-wearing women in a maternity clinic and white women in an abortion clinic, and the caption, "This is white genocide." And so more and more, we were seeing this push against abortion rights coming from this really far-right, fascistic, racist, and white supremacist ideology, saying that in order to save the white race from genocide, we need to ban abortion for white women, ban contraception, and have, genocidal policies towards Black and minority ethnic people. And that kind of genocidal policy comes from either suggestions of forced sterilization to what Richard Spencer, the American neo-Nazi leader, described as ethical ethnic cleansing. That was it, ethical ethnic cleansing. So this was all very interesting, and I was like, I'm quite fascinated by how these organizations group together and the theories that they propagate and how they're trying to attack liberal democratic values through women's bodies. But if it was all just happening on far-right Telegram, I think we could all rest easy. If it was just these horrible people talking to themselves about their horrible ideas, we could safely ignore them and let them get on with it, because we would not have to worry about whether these ideas were becoming mainstream. But unfortunately, that is not the world we are living in. And so what I was really interested in, and when I started writing the book and doing this investigative journalism into anti-abortion movements, was whether or not this was having an impact on the political system and having an impact on women's lives around the world. And increasingly, over the last 5 to 10 years, particularly since 2015, we have seen a real ramping up of Great Replacement conspiracy theory into mainstream politics. And the example that I really focus on in the book is Orban's Hungary. So in 2017, we started to see Viktor Orban, who's a far-right authoritarian leader in Hungary, talking more and more about demographics, about demographic winters, about replacement, about how one of his ministers said there would be 20 million more Hungarians today if it wasn't for abortion. And this kind of happened alongside very draconian, very violent anti-migrant policies coming out of Hungary, and a massive imperative on ethnic Hungarian married women to have more children for the Hungarian nation. I think it was in 2019 when Orban was speaking at a demographics conference that he actually first sort of used the term replacement in his speech. And it was this moment to me that Great Replacement conspiracy theory went into the mainstream. Here we have like an EU leader with quite a lot of influence in right-wing and far-right politics, actively speaking about replacement and putting in policies that he dresses up as, family protection, but which are really coming from a nationalist impulse and a white supremacist impulse. Similarly, in the States, I think it was in 2021, I want to say. We saw a congressman called Steve King talk again about how American culture was being replaced as a result of migration and literally millions of abortions. And in Italy, when I was writing the book, Salvini was the sort of more dominant far-right leader. He's now, been sort of overtaken by Meloni. But Salvini would talk about demographic winters in Italy and that this was the result of abortion and immigration. So rather than this being something that was just existing in kind of nasty online subcultures, this was now being voiced by world leaders on the world stage who had the power to build in policy that stripped women of their human rights, stripped migrant people of their human rights, and stripped LGBTQ plus people of their human rights. So that's kind of how I saw this anti-abortion ideology moving into the mainstream and how far-right policies were becoming more focused on gender and women's bodies. But how does this all get funded? And I know in the programme it specifically says about funding, so I thought I would talk a little bit about the funding streams for this. So in my book, I look particularly at Europe and how anti-abortion movements are funded in Europe. And there's sort of 3 pots of money coming into the European space. The first is money from Europe itself. We tend to have this idea, as my friend Neil put it, that Europe would just be nicely progressive if it wasn't for those Americans meddling in our politics. But actually, Europe has a lot of anti-abortion money swimming around. And a lot of it comes from sort of aristocratic family foundations. Like one day I'm going to make a program called Whatever Happened to the Habsburgs? And the answer is they're funding anti-abortion initiatives. And so we see a lot of kind of big aristocratic foundations funding anti-abortion activity, funding organizations such as Citizen Go, such as the World Congress of Families. And then one of the really interesting things that I investigated this year, and was a big exclusive that we ran on Open Democracy and in the Times, is how even the European Union funds anti-abortion activity in Europe. So we uncovered how the European Union's Erasmus scheme had given, I think, 1.2 million euros to the World Youth Alliance, which is an anti-abortion organization that believes abortion can cause infertility and is linked to the cancers, which we know is anti-abortion disinformation, and which doesn't consider abortion to be reproductive health care. They got nearly €500,000 to run an education program on reproductive health, and they don't believe abortion is reproductive health care. So the European Commission is now investigating that grant, thanks to my investigation. But then we come to the US, and the US is, again, one of the biggest funders of anti-abortion activity in Europe. And unsurprisingly, we see a lot of people who are close both to the first Trump presidency putting money into this area. So we have money from the DeVos Family Foundation. Betsy DeVos was Trump's education secretary. And also from the Prince Family Foundation, which is Betsy DeVos's parents. We also see a lot of money coming from the so-called religious freedom giant Alliance Defending Freedom. They're based in Arizona and were really instrumental in the overruling of Roe v. Wade in America. And they have spent, I think, they give about, I'm going to get it wrong, they give a few £100,000 a year, I'm going to be vague, into the UK to fund anti-abortion and anti-LGBT activity in the UK. And that money has been going up, the amount that ADF International is spending in the UK to fund anti-gender initiatives. And then the third pot of money comes from Russia. Again, that's probably not surprising. And it's quite difficult to track the money that comes from Russia because a lot of it is very, very dark. But we do know that in the 2010s, a lot of money was coming from the oligarch Konstantin Malofeev, who employed Alexander Dugin, who Kavita mentioned in her talk at his TV station. And again, we saw these kind of Russian oligarchs, Malofeev and Volodymyr Yakunin, spending a huge amount of money on European activity, partly because of their anti-abortion beliefs, but partly to try and sow division within Europe in the run-up to everything that's happened in the past 10 years. So those are the kind of big funding pots that we see. And if you have like specific questions about funding, I'll do my best to answer them in the Q&A. So I wanted to finish this by talking about where we are now. When I was writing the book, Roe v. Wade was overruled during the second draft, when I was editing the second draft, and I knew that Roe v. Wade was going. You don't spend, 5 years investigating anti-abortion movements and not seeing what was on the writing that was on the wall. But it still was a massive shock. Since Roe v. Wade was overruled in the States, we have seen an emboldened anti-abortion movement around the world. And I think that's really crucial to understand. What happens in America doesn't stay in America, unfortunately. We have seen the arguments that were used in the Dobbs ruling to argue against abortion in various countries in the global south, including Kenya and Nigeria. And we see even in the UK a sort of emboldened anti-abortion movement who are becoming more vocal and more active, although they remain very strongly in the minority, and who, sort of take inspiration from the American situation to say, if they can end it there, we can end it here. I think it's really crucial to understand that the situation in the States is not unique. Women have obviously started dying in the US as a result of the Dobbs decision. ProPublica has been doing some really fantastic reporting on the stories of women who have died, but we know also that they are not all the women, because many families who lose someone as a result of being denied abortion care are understandably reticent about talking to the press. But this has been happening all over the world. In Poland, after they tightened their anti-abortion laws at the beginning of January 2022, 7 women died within the year as a result of those abortion laws changing. In Kenya, 2,000 women die every year as a result of unsafe abortion. The fact is that while these tragedies that we are seeing kind of coming to the fore in the US are horrific and awful, thousands of women die every year as a result of the anti-abortion laws that we live with. But I'm really interested now in what's going to happen next in America. I think what we have seen is a very clear program coming out of the far right in the US. They are very confident in what they want to do. And when that comes to abortion, it means that they are going to implement a national abortion ban. They won't call it that. They will call it a national consensus or a national limit, but fundamentally it will be a national abortion ban. If they don't manage to achieve that, they're going to come after abortion pills. We've already seen Supreme Court cases looking at the so-called, dangers of medical abortion. And when you have a situation where women in states where abortion is banned, their only access to any kind of reproductive health care is by ordering pills by post, this, will be catastrophic to women in those states. And of course, they're going to come after contraception. And this is the one that always seems quite controversial because people don't believe me, but people didn't believe me about Roe, and these terrible things do happen. There has been a massive concerted effort in the anti-abortion movement against contraception. They try and portray contraception as a form of abortion. They talk about IUDs and the morning after pill as abortifacients, even though they are not a form of abortion, they are a form of contraception. And there has been various Supreme Court cases, including ones involving Alliance Defending Freedom, to try and strip away the rights of women to access contraception and to prioritize the so-called religious freedom of those who provide contraception or provide like healthcare insurance. So I think that's going to be the next big battle in the States. And the reason they are doing this, the reason the far right go after abortion, the reason these authoritarian Christian nationalists go after abortion is because they want to restore this idea of the natural order. And once we understand that there is a fascist impulse to deny women their human rights, to deny women equality, to say to women that they are inferior and subordinate to men, and that women's role is reproductive, and that women have to be pinned to the domestic, then you can start to understand why gender has become such a battleground. These men and their female allies want male supremacy. They want women to be seen as non-human. And that is what abortion bans are all about. They strip women of our humanity. They tell us that we are non-human, and we have to fight back because we are human, and abortion rights are human rights.
Thank you so much, Sian. Thank you so much, Kavita. That was just rich, fascinating lead off. So I will ask anyone that wants to. Now we've got about 20 minutes or so to take comments, audience questions from the audience. If you can come up and use the mic, that would be good. Not just so everyone can hear you, but also so Kavita can hear you from the Zoom room. So, okay. So hand at the back and then you at the front.
Hi, everybody. My name's Elaine Jones. I'm a member of Workers' Liberty, and I'm also a trade unionist. I'm on the national executive of Unison, the trade union for public workers and local government workers. Just wanted to make a couple of points, really, in response to the things that the speakers have said. Is that okay? Is the sound all right, or is it not okay? Sorry? Okay, is that better? Right, okay. Just in response to what you were saying really about how why now and what's the tipping point, because these ideas have been on the far right and have we can say that they've been on the sort of fringes of politics for a while, and then what is it about now that means that they're suddenly gaining traction? And I think you have to put it against the backdrop of what the capitalist class are doing and the growth of inequality. And so I was reading some stuff about how in the 1920s and 30s, similar time when there was an environment of fear, conspiracy, which led to the growth of the far right. The other thing that you've got that's the same now is you've got the gap between rich and poor. You've got the capitalist class clawing back all the gains that our movement made in relation to public services. So the two go together. It's about the attacks on women's rights are also to do with the capitalist class trying to maintain their wealth. And I think, you know, why are the attacks on women's rights central to the far right? And I think that's to do with the role of the family under capitalism and why that helps capitalism continue. I think the other point to make that I think is important is that why socialism, and why we have to make the case for socialism and be specific about why we're socialists in these struggles. And that's because we can win gains under capitalism. We can win rights. We can win various rights for women. We can win rights for public services. But when we stop fighting, they come back for them. They're not static. The system isn't static. We think we've won arguments, but they'll come back for us. And the point about arguing for socialism with all of within these movements is to make the case for a different system, which means that it's not just transient. We're fighting for a system which means that we produce things on the basis of need and not profit, and that system is an ongoing system that isn't subject to the ups and downs and the booms and slumps of a capitalist system. So I think it's just important to hold on to why socialism, and also why the organised working class and the trade union movement is central to all of these these movements too. When we're fighting for women's politics, we need to take those politics into the trade union movement and build class-based movements in opposition to what's happening.
Can you hear me? Yep. So I just wanted to ask a couple of questions addressed to our speakers and also to the audience. We've from both of our speakers today, we've heard about how various issues, and in this case, women's rights, are strongly connected to other right-wing movements and the right wing in general. And even across countries, for example, in America, historically and now, like leftism is associated with non-American, people and non-Americanism. And, Putin talks about the liberal West, even though the West isn't very liberal at the moment. And I wanted to ask both the audience and the speakers, why do you think that is? Why do you think it is that gender and other such issues are such sticking points and are so widely applicable that the right wing finds them useful to use to attract people to their movements across the world? It's not just one country, but almost everywhere, it seems, that gender and similar sort of progressive issues are something that every right-wing movement in every country can make use of.
I've got 3 other people so far indicating to speak from the audience, but I think Sian wants to just come back at this point to respond to what's been said.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I wanted to agree with the woman who was making her points before, because I think it is really important that we understand the links between reproductive exploitation, abortion bans, and capitalism. When we have seen backlashes against abortion in the past, be that in the sort of 16th century, if you go all the way back to the 19th century in the UK and the US, to 1920s Italy and 1930s Germany, it has always been linked to a crisis in capitalism and a need to see women's bodies as an economic resource to be exploited, with reproduction the means of that exploitation. I think it's really worth reading Silvia Federici's, Caliban and the Witch, which really kind of goes deep into why these time periods and why these anxieties about women's bodies happen when they do. In the US, when they first banned abortion in the 1860s, it was a massive moment of anxieties about migration, anxieties about women gaining political freedoms and fighting for things like the vote and, basic human rights, and the end of the enslavement of people. And there was a doctor called Harold Storer who said, the future of America rests in women's loins. It was this idea that if we don't see women as exploitable resources, then the whole nation is in danger, the whole nation falls apart. And what we've seen, particularly since 2008, is this, rising collapse in, crisis in capitalism that has led to a rise in the far right, alongside this attack on women's bodies and women's rights, because there is this real fear and this need of the so-called demographic crisis. And the way you solve the demographic crisis is by treating women as resources.
Thank you, Sian. So before I take another round of questions, Kavita, did you want to come in? You don't have to, but if you wanted to.
I do just want to really briefly respond to Sian's really good, really wonderful presentation, because the same thing, there are so many things which excite me about what you were saying, which you mentioned, I think, the Alliance Defending Freedom. So that the name rang a bell in my head, because it is an organization in India. It's an organization which, represents itself as fighting for the right to, protecting Christian minorities from Hindu supremacist violence, and, against sex selective abortions and so on. But it's actually such an extremely dangerous organization. But it has managed. I'm really interested in the ways in which these things creep under the skin of our skin, basically, and start seeming very normal and natural and okay. So there was a lot about that, including about the funding and that you were saying about Russian funding as well, and all of that, which I found really interesting. So I just wanted to mention that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to respond to the question about why gender, like why is it that gender sort of has this particular grip in to such an extent? And I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's, it's partly because I think, the oppression of women is based on something real, and that is the role of women, collectively, not necessarily any individual woman as, the people who give birth. Or at least are perceived as having the possibility of giving birth, and so historically have tended to have a larger role in reproduction. And I think it comes down, so it's not just something kind of artificial that arises from nowhere. It's something that is grounded in the actual sort of physical experience of being a woman, and it applies even to women who, actually personally cannot have children, but nonetheless, because of this general association of child rearing with womanhood in society, are kind of then, when they go for a job interview, they're like, you're a 30-something woman. you might have kids. I'm going to have second thoughts about employing you. So I think that, you know, part of the reason why gender has such a grip within these debates is that actually, to some extent, what feminists are doing is, you know, historically over time, we have been using the best technology that has been produced in capitalist societies to try and say, actually, we don't have to be like bound to that biology. We could use this technology to kind of move beyond it. We could do other things. And then, you know, the right are saying, no, you go back to like the traditional role of your biological body. And I think it's just, you know, I think that material reality like partly explains why it is this particular issue has such grip, because it can seem like quite common sense. Yeah, of course, you know, women have babies and women should go and look after them. I mean, that it has a very easy, simplistic kind of appeal. And to argue that we should use technology perhaps in ways that enable us to do different things with our lives is, you know, that is a very big challenge in a way. And it's an argument that, you know, we might have thought we had won, but clearly there's a great deal more to do.
Hi, my name's Ali. I'm in Sheffield, in Workers' Liberty in Sheffield. I just wanted to ask a question. In the latest Trump victory, there's been quite a lot of, not necessarily left-wing commentators, but commentators sort of saying that the issue of the fact that Kamala Harris put reproductive rights central in her campaign didn't really have the reach at a time when people are struggling economically. And I think it's really important when we're talking about these issues that we do talk about them from a working class perspective, in terms of, we know that reproductive rights are less accessible to people who've got less wealth. We know trans rights are a class issue. And yeah, I just wanted to get the comments from the speakers on that. I think that we have to, at a time when, you know, we just have to link those issues up and put class at very central. We're not going to, you know, I think the Labour Party, I think the Democrats will move against talking about feminism and reproductive rights. I think they will. I think they'll drop those issues. I think we have to ensure that those issues are central, but recognise that they are class issues and that our feminism needs to be class struggle and socialist feminism.
Okay, I think I've got a couple more speakers from the floor. Okay, you at the back, then you in the green jacket, and then I'll have time to take you as well.
Hello, I'm Jill Mountford, and I'm a member of Workers' Liberty in London. And I wanted to, first of all, thank the two speakers. I think we've got a really good outline of some of the most important issues that should make us really, really enraged. But like with Sean, optimism far, far outweighs my rage. And believe me, I've got a lot of rage about this stuff. The idea that in the 21st century, with all the progress in science and technology, that women can be facing the threat in the West and in the lower South of losing abortion rights and control over our bodies and our reproduction rights, and that we still face, to greater or lesser degrees, depending on where you are in the world, incredible threats of sexual violence, is astonishing. And we better understand that none of this can be stopped or defeated by signing petitions or engaging in campaigns on the internet. As useful as that can be for touching base and making connections and stuff, it will only be through organising in the workplaces and in our communities and in the labour movement that we will defeat this stuff. Rosa Luxemburg talks about barbarism or socialism. Either the far right will win or we will win, our ideas will win, to build a better, safer, more democratic and fairer and equal world. We won't find that under capitalism. Capitalism allows the far right to grow in periods like this. So we've got a big job on our hands. And it's women in this room and men in this room And those like us outside in the broader movement are going to defeat this. At the moment, we've got a situation in Britain where the abortion rights movements are not fit for purpose. They don't even answer the telephone, take 6 months to answer an email. We have to organise a movement that can take on and defeat. And that means that we have to go out and we have to talk to people. We have to agitate. We have to educate people about these ideas, and we have to organise ourselves and other people. And it's the only way that we're going to defeat the far right and any of the attacks that we're suffering. So I would urge anybody who's not already involved in any campaigns to get to talk to some of us who are involved in campaigns. I'd urge us all to spend less time on the internet and on WhatsApp groups and more time out on the streets, organising and arguing and raising our voices, our collective voices. And that is the way that we're going to defeat this.
Yeah, Kathy, also in London Workers' Liberty, involved in London Workers' Liberty. The speakers today have talked a lot about the Great Replacement theory, and I think it's interesting about how that maps across anti-migrant agitation and campaigns for deportations, and also across, you know, attacks on gender rights. And it's not interesting, it's scary because it operates at different levels. It operates at a level of a conspiracy theory that you hear people just, you know, idly talk about, to actual policy of actual governments. And, you know, some people have just sort of tried to link how that is rooted in sort of structural ways in which gender oppression happens. I think all of that is true, but there's another aspect to it all, which I think is really important, and that is that this really amplifies and really makes simple and really pushes the far right's ultra-nationalist agenda. And we're living, and I'm sorry to make it even more grim, we are living in a world where more war, more division, more national barriers are going to increase and escalate. And they're going to escalate quite quickly next year, I think, unfortunately, including in places like Ukraine. And I think the Ukrainian people are in real danger of being defeated. So this is a serious business. And I think an aspect of all this is our internationalism. It's incredibly important that we have that internationalist perspective as well. And that we are prepared to make solidarity with people all around the world. I mean, all around the world. And particularly, you know, particularly obviously women and migrants who are going to be at the sharp end of this. I mean, we make solidarity with Palestinians, we make solidarity with Ukrainians, but we've got to think about those other places in the world where wars are going on and are going to flare up as well. And, you know, women will, you know, be particularly at the sharp end of that. So I think that's the thing I wanted to emphasize. I'm involved in Ukraine solidarity work. In particular, there's a conference coming up in February of trade unionists. And I've got leaflets here, so if people want to know more, then come and ask me. And there's various other people as well who are helping to build that. Sorry for going on.
Yeah, I'm Alice. And I think it was what Ali was saying before, I want to say, but about now that the Democrats lost, despite making abortion such a central part of their campaign, like how much sort of they're going to shift away from talking about reproductive rights. And I just sort of wondering, like, audiences and your guys' thoughts on the impact of such a influential political party globally deprioritizing abortion rights in their left wing, even though I'm sure like the left in America and the women in America will continue to prioritize it because it's such a central part of their lives, how sort of the political deprioritization will have sort of a knock-on effect globally for other political left-wing parties and how central they will then keep abortion rights in their campaigns.
Okay, I think I've got time for one more contribution from the floor. So please, yeah, come forward, and then I'll ask Sian, then Kavita to sum up. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Dominica, I'm from Manchester. So, you know, we're actually reading your chapter in our next Manchester Socialist Feminist book club. And I think one of the things that I kind of wanted to raise and add to the conversation about reproductive rights and the Trump's election is that many white women kind of voted for Trump. And, you know, one of your chapters says trad wives, and how about women turn to far right as well, and they don't see feminism as a liberation movement for them and turn to far right. And I think they don't see feminism as a liberation movement because they see it through neoliberal lens of capitalism and thinking they can have it all. And capitalism does not allow family and social provisions that allow equity in raising children and having a community in a way that allows for work and balance of it all. So I think that interesting conversation needs to be had, that capitalism just doesn't allow for liberation of women or people with reproductive rights. And they just, yeah, the feminism within capitalism is just not sustainable and is not efficient. And, you know, this rise of far right and fascism in Poland has its own lens, as I'm Polish, and how much of it is under disguise of Catholic Church and how much of it is, you know, a lot of far right or those who protest against reproductive rights, they disguise it as the religious reasons, but a lot of it is fueled by control, and that's what it is. And I think we need to have that conversation, how much of it is about male control and how much of the male control has been loosened with, you know, there has been some, you know, progress with women's rights and this whole male loneliness and, you know, blaming women because they don't want to have, you know, the incel culture and all of that. It all comes back to male entitlement within, and how is that shaped by capitalism of what male should be, and instead of how we should be as human being and have a communal ties. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much to everyone from the audience that has spoken today. So I'm going to invite Sian and then Kavita for approximately 5 minutes each to sum up. So Sian.
Yes, so I said at the beginning that while I am full of rage, I also have a lot of optimism. I think it's really important that we recognize the very, very real dangers to women's rights, and particularly women's reproductive rights, and the impact that this abortion bans and the far right attacks on women's rights have, you know, in the fact that women die as a result of this, but also every woman is living in a situation where they are told they are less than human and that they are less than men. But there is a lot of hope. In the UK, we have seen really important progress on abortion rights in the last couple of years, from the decriminalisation of abortion in Northern Ireland, despite the very real challenges of provision of services. That was a huge step. To the loosening of some of the restrictions in the 1967 Abortion Act so that women can now access telemedicine and have pills via post for early abortion. And most recently, the introduction of buffer zones so that women no longer have to face anti-abortion protesters while accessing reproductive health care. These are real wins, and they are hard-won wins. And it's very easy to forget when everything is awful that wins still matter and they still happen. I'm really lucky in that in my job, I've got to travel around the world and meet incredible pro-abortion activists and advocates in places like Kenya, where, you know, amazing grassroots organizations are working in rural areas and in the cities to ensure that women have access to abortion information. I've reported from Poland, where, you know, incredibly restrictive abortion laws have, as I said, led to horrific tragedies. But again, where we see really innovative, incredible organizations like the Abortion Dream Team making a real difference to women's lives and helping women access abortion within the very, very strong restrictions of the laws. I was in Ukraine last year and, you know, interviewed amazing feminist activists who were like campaigning against some of the horrific implications of that war and the impact of rape as a weapon of war, and also fighting for reproductive rights. And in the last couple of years, even though, you know, Roe going was the big one, we've seen decriminalization in places where I never imagined abortion would become legal. In Ireland, in Argentina, we've seen the green wave revolution in Latin America. That means, you know, state after state in Mexico has decriminalized abortion. So over and over again, we are seeing these really important wins. And while the backlash is real, so is the pro-abortion movement. You know, we are out there, we are making change. And I really wanted to, you know, comment on the point about having international solidarity. There are so many lessons we can learn from grassroots activists in the global south who face these huge restrictions and yet are making change happen in their communities, both on a local and national and international level. And when Roe was overruled, I did a story where I spoke to the Centre for Reproductive Rights, and she reminded me that in the 50 years since Roe, 53 countries have improved access to abortion and only 4 have rolled access back, the 4th being America. So the momentum is in our favour, and if we move forward as a strong, united, socialist, internationalist, feminist movement, that's a lot of is in that sentence, we can have real change. The far right does not get to win this fight. We do, and we will.
Kavita, over to you.
Yes, I'd also like to say it's been such a brilliant conference. It's been such a brilliant session. And I really, really wish that I were there to be able to talk to the people in the room even after the session. Yes, I do agree absolutely with Sian that there is room for hope. I am, but at the same time, I feel as though this is a time to recognize that things are not as they were even a decade ago. This is a period of unusual defeat. And that's where I'm going to say this, although I know that it isn't very well received on the left, but I do think that it is a time to rethink a little bit about whether all of this can be explained only in terms of capitalism as a capital C kind of undifferentiated thing. Because I do think that, what we are witnessing today is not simply a product of capitalism. There are different ways in which people choose to live in capitalist worlds. And in India, coming from India, I can say that the fight for democracy, when you're fighting for democratic rights, of course, you're fighting for democratic rights where capitalism, in factories and in so many ways in which in the farmlands which are being taken away, all of that. But at the same time, in India, I see this tendency, even in the women's movement, to be anti-feminist under the cover of being anti-capitalist. So to look at individual rights as individual licentiousness, sexual licentiousness, I know that isn't a problem where you are sitting right now. But I just want to say that the world is a large place, and what we are saying is heard across the world. And so I would again urge that when it comes to these struggles, the need to focus more on defining ourselves, defining feminists as defenders of basic, bare minimum democratic rights, really, where the bar has been lowered, and the fight for socialism being an aspiration for something in the future, not a choice right now between the fascists or the socialists. No, I mean, I'm afraid that socialism is not going to, it's a unicorn right now as a replacement to the barbarism we are seeing now. Yes, we should be socialists in order to see a future which is more consistently democratic than, more consistently human than what capitalism has offered till now. But right now, there has to be a defense of, and which means an alliance with those who have double standards or who are weak, feminism within capitalism, liberal feminism, because I'm sure that's happening. That is how the victories that Sian spoke of are happening. But I just felt that speaking from where I am, where I'm in a very dark place, where I feel as though the tiny rights which are already beleaguered here, which are there in the constitution and in the laws, but are not there in society, where people are getting killed even as I speak for marrying out of the caste before Modi. And now that is, even the law and the constitution is being eroded. And that constitution and that law, the far right is saying, oh, that's all Western capitalism. And here we are, to offer a whole. That's a time at which I just feel that at least here, I can't anchor my arguments in a discourse of capitalism as an explanatory framework alone. And I just wanted to share that as someone who very much is on the left, but is just thinking about ways of communicating differently.
Very much. Thank you, Kavita. So once again, absolutely sincere thanks to Kavita and Sian for speaking today. So that's the close of the session. Ali, are you going to give details of where the lunch is going to be held? So thank you again to you both.